Charleston in 1832 breathed with a strange rhythm, one that blended the salty air drifting in from the harbor with the heavy scent of magnolia blossoms and smoke from kitchens where enslaved hands stirred pots not their own. The city's grand avenues shone with carriages and silk dresses, yet just beneath the polished surface was a pulse of unease. Rumors of uprisings traveled faster than the ships anchored at the docks, and every whisper carried both fear and hope. For those who lived in chains, Charleston was not a place of beauty, but a gilded cage. Among the hundreds bound by that cage was Dinah, a young woman whose quiet eyes had seen more than she would ever speak aloud. She belonged to the household of Edward Whitmore, a man whose wealth rested on acres of cotton and on the people he claimed as property. Dinah rose before dawn, her bare feet brushing against cool wooden floors as she lit fires in the hearth and prepared the day for others. Her world was one of constant motion and silence, where every gesture was measured, every word weighed. Yet within her silence lived something that even chains could not contain. It was a small ember hidden deep, the memory of songs sung in hushed tones by her mother before the lash tore her away, the echo of stories passed among the enslaved in the dim light of cabins. Dinah carried them like treasures, though they cost her nothing and yet risked everything. She knew that to dream of freedom was dangerous, but to surrender the dream was to die while still breathing. The Whitmore mansion stood tall on Meeting Street, a proud example of Charleston's grandeur. Its white columns stretched upward as if declaring victory over time itself. Inside, the walls were lined with fine fabrics, imported china, and books bound in leather that Dinah was forbidden even to touch. Guests praised the family's refinement, never noticing the hands that served them with bowed heads. For Dinah, every polished surface only reflected her own invisibility. Edward Whitmore was a man convinced of his own greatness, and Charleston society confirmed it daily. He walked with the arrogance of one who believed he commanded not only his household, but destiny itself. His voice cut through rooms like a blade, and he relished the obedience it commanded. Beside him, his wife Caroline embodied the manners of refinement, though beneath her calm exterior lingered a tremor of fragility. She often watched Dinah with a gaze that seemed torn between pity and fear, yet never once did she extend her hand in protection. Dinah's life unfolded in the quiet corners of this world, polishing silver, preparing meals, carrying trays of wine. Her days were filled with labor, her nights with silence, yet each time she passed a mirror or the painted eyes of her master's ancestors staring from the walls, she felt the ember inside her stir. It was as though even the house itself reminded her of her place, pressing against her spirit until it threatened to suffocate. The city outside the mansion's gates hummed with contradictions. Merchants called from their stalls, sailors argued at taverns, and beneath it all lay the trade of human bodies at the markets on Chalmers Street. Dinah had once been led through those markets, her wrists bound, her name spoken by strangers, deciding her worth. The memory lingered like a scar. To walk the streets of Charleston now was to walk among ghosts, each corner whispering of lives stolen and hopes crushed. And yet, Dinah did not walk with her head bowed in her heart, even if her eyes betrayed obedience. Within her, the ember burned hotter each day, fanned by every insult, every command, every reminder that she was considered less than human. The world expected her to endure silently, to vanish into the shadows of history, but she was not made for silence forever. This is the story of Dinah of Charleston, the enslaved woman who chose fire over submission and dared to strike where her master least expected. Before her journey unfolds, let me ask you, if you want to uncover more untold stories of courage, resilience, and forgotten voices of history, be sure to subscribe now so you will not miss what comes next. For Dinah's tale is only beginning, and every ember needs only the smallest breath to become a flame. The Whitmore household moved to a rhythm as steady as the tide, though its beat was dictated by Edward Whitmore's temper and whims. At dawn, the mansion stirred awake, not because of its master's rising, but because of the quiet labor of those who served him. Fires already burned in the kitchens, iron pots simmered, and polished boots stood ready by the doors. Dinah was often among the first to rise, her steps soft on the wooden floors as she lit candles and prepared trays. She moved with the precision of someone who knew that one mistake could bring punishment swift and severe. The house itself was a monument to Charleston's wealth. Its tall windows allowed sunlight to pour over carpets imported from Europe, and the halls smelled faintly of lemon oil from constant polishing. To the Whitmores it was a display of refinement, but to Dinah and the others who kept it gleaming, it was a cage of endless tasks. Every corner held a memory of toil, every polished surface a reflection of exhaustion. Edward Whitmore reigned over this world like a king within his fortress. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark coats trimmed neatly, he carried himself as though his authority was beyond question. He spoke in clipped tones, his commands leaving no room for hesitation. "Dinah, more wine." Samuel fetched the carriage. His words were not requests but declarations, each one a reminder of the hierarchy that defined their lives. To him, obedience was as natural as breathing, and gratitude was not expected. It was irrelevant. Caroline Whitmore, by contrast, moved with delicate grace. She wore silk dresses that swept noiselessly across the floors, her fair hands gloved even within her own home. Yet behind her composure lingered a kind of nervous fragility. She often looked at Dinah with eyes that seemed to want to say more than her lips dared. On rare occasions she softened her voice. "Dinah, place the vase near the window, please." But her kindness never crossed the invisible line of rebellion. She benefited from the system that bound Dinah, even as a part of her flinched at its cruelty. The kitchen was the true heart of the mansion, though its warmth came not from love but from necessity. Dinah spent much of her day there, stirring stews, baking bread, preparing dishes that would be praised at the Whitmores' table, but never credited to her. Alongside her worked Ruth, a younger girl who had not yet learned the art of masking defiance behind lowered eyes. Ruth whispered jokes in the dim light, quick words that drew faint smiles from Dinah when no one was watching. At times Dinah crossed paths with Samuel, the older man who tended the stables. His back was bent with years of labor, yet his eyes held a sharpness untouched by age. He often spoke in quiet fragments, wisdom laced with caution. "Keep your head low, Dinah," he muttered one morning, as she carried bread to the dining room. "This house eats those who dare stand tall." She gave no reply, but his words lingered in her thoughts. Evenings in the Whitmore household reflected Charleston's grandeur. Guests arrived in carriages, their laughter spilling across the marble steps. Dinah moved among them silently, refilling glasses, offering trays of oysters, her presence acknowledged only when needed. The men spoke loudly of politics and profit, their voices thick with wine. The women admired each other's gowns, their words dripping with courtesy. And above it all, Edward Whitmore presided, the proud host whose wealth depended on invisible labor. For Dinah, these evenings were endless performances. She had mastered the art of vanishing in plain sight, her face expressionless, her movements precise. Yet every time she refilled her master's glass or brushed past the painted portraits that lined the walls, a question pressed heavier on her heart. How long could one endure a life where even breath was borrowed? She swallowed the question each night, for survival demanded silence. But silence did not mean surrender. In the quiet of her mind, where no whip or command could reach, Dinah's thoughts moved restlessly, searching for something she could not yet name. The Whitmore household seemed eternal, its routines unshakable, its master untouchable. But beneath the polish and order, tension brewed like a storm waiting on the horizon. And Dinah, though still hidden in shadow, was already listening to its distant thunder. Charleston's air carried more than the scent of salt and jasmine, it carried whispers. News traveled not only through the newspapers read by the wealthy, but also in songs hummed in fields, in fragments of conversation exchanged at markets, in words carried from plantation to plantation by enslaved men hired out for work. Dinah listened carefully, for listening was as vital as breathing. One evening, as she scrubbed silver in the kitchen, Ruth leaned close, her eyes wide. "They say men rose up in Virginia, Dinah. Killed their masters, burned the houses. Nat Turner led them, that's the name." Dinah paused, cloth in hand, her heart quickening. "And what happened after?" she asked softly, careful that no ears lingered beyond the doorway. "They were caught," Ruth whispered, her voice shrinking to almost nothing. hanged, whipped, torn apart. But before that, they fought. They fought like free men. The word struck Dinah like a spark. Fear and awe tangled in her chest. She had never seen Virginia, but the idea that chains could be broken, even briefly, was enough to feed the ember she carried inside. She returned to her work in silence, though her hands trembled. Later, while fetching water at the well, she found Samuel waiting. His shoulders stooped yet steady as stone. He spoke in the low, measured way of a man who knew danger lurked in every syllable. "Ruth's been talking too loud," he muttered, eyes fixed on the bucket as it filled. "But what she told you, yes, it's true, and it ain't the first time. Haiti burned not 20 years past." White men here still wake sweating from that memory. Dinah had heard fragments of Haiti before, the island where the enslaved had risen and claimed freedom, but hearing it again, in Samuel's voice, made it sharper, more real. She lowered her eyes. "Do you believe it could happen here?" Samuel gave a dry chuckle. "Charleston? With patrols at every corner, rifles in every hand? No, girl. This city runs on fear, and fear cuts both ways." Still he leaned closer, his voice barely more than breath. "But remember this, no chain lasts forever. The masters know it. That's why they watch us so close." The weight of his words settled over Dinah as she walked back to the mansion. She looked at the grand houses with their iron gates and balconies draped in flowers, and for the first time, she noticed the tension beneath their beauty. Every polished brick seemed to tremble with the fear of what might happen if the enslaved stopped bowing their heads. That night, as she lay on her narrow cot in the quarters behind the mansion, Dinah stared into the darkness. Around her others slept, their breathing heavy with exhaustion. She thought of her mother torn from her years before, of faces she could no longer recall clearly. She wondered if they had ever dreamed of fighting, if they had carried embers inside them too. Sleep did not come easily. Instead, she heard Samuel's words echo. No chain lasts forever. The idea took root in her mind, small but insistent. She imagined what it would mean to walk freely, to decide her own steps, to live without lowering her eyes at every command. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. The following days, Dinah listened even more closely. In the marketplace, she caught fragments of dock workers murmuring about patrols doubling after rumors of rebellion. In the kitchen, she overheard merchants warning Whitmore about unrest among the Negroes. Each word was another thread in the growing fabric of possibility. Ruth, with her youthful defiance, whispered one evening, "If they could fight in Virginia, why not here?" Dinah hushed her sharply, eyes darting to the door. "Quiet, Ruth. Words can be heavier than chains." Yet even as she silenced the girl, her own heart betrayed her, beating faster at the very thought. Something inside her shifted. She had lived with endurance as her shield, silence as her weapon. But now, silence felt too small. The seed had been planted. And though it remained hidden, it waited, gathering strength, just as surely as storms gathered over Charleston's harbor before breaking into thunder. Summer's heat pressed heavily over Charleston, and inside the Whitmore mansion, preparations for something new stirred the household. Edward Whitmore, restless in his constant pursuit of grandeur, had decided his likeness should be preserved in oil and canvas. "A man's legacy," he declared to his wife one morning, "is not in fleeting words, but in what endures after him. This house, this wealth, this face, future generations will remember it all." Caroline Whitmore offered a delicate smile, though her voice carried no warmth. "Of course, Edward, it will honor the family name." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Dinah, who poured coffee silently, her expression unreadable. Days later, an artist arrived, his easel and paints carried into the grand parlor. He was a thin man with careful hands, quick to flatter Whitmore's posture, his jawline, the curve of his shoulders. Dinah passed in and out of the room with trays, her eyes lingering on the canvas as the portrait took shape. With each stroke of the brush, Edward Whitmore seemed to grow larger, not only in size but in presence, his painted gaze following her even when her back was turned. At night, when the parlor emptied and silence filled the mansion, Dinah sometimes stood at the threshold staring at the unfinished portrait. The whites of his painted eyes gleamed faintly in the moonlight, watching her as though mocking the very air she breathed. The more complete the portrait became, the heavier it pressed upon her spirit. Ruth noticed Dinah's silence one evening in the kitchen. "What troubles you?" she asked while kneading dough, flour streaking her arms. "That picture," Dinah answered after a long pause. "It stares as if it knows me, as if it owns more than my hands." Ruth frowned. "It's just paint." "No," Dinah murmured, shaking her head. "It's him. Even when he sleeps, it will be him, always watching." The portrait soon became the centerpiece of the household. Guests marveled at its detail, praising the artist and flattering Whitmore. "A man of stature," one gentleman said, admiring the way Whitmore's likeness dominated the parlor wall. Dinah stood in the corner, tray in hand, her face lowered, though inside her heart beat faster with every word. For Edward Whitmore, the portrait was proof of his permanence. For Dinah, it was a symbol of suffocation. Every day she passed beneath it, balancing trays of wine or polishing silver. Its painted eyes bore into her, a reminder that her master intended his power to outlive him. One afternoon, Samuel entered the parlor to tend to the fireplace. He lingered a moment by the portrait, shaking his head. When he found Dinah later by the stables, he muttered, "Men like him build monuments to themselves." "They believe walls and paint can hold back time?" Dinah asked quietly. "And do you believe it?" Samuel's gaze met hers, steady and grave. "Nothing lasts forever, girl. Not chains, not portraits, not even the men who think themselves gods." His words struck deep, lodging themselves beside the whispers of Virginia and Haiti. Dinah began to see the portrait not only as a symbol of power but as a challenge. If it was meant to outlive its master, what would it mean to see it destroyed? At night, when the house lay in darkness, she returned again and again in thought to that painted face. The artist had captured Whitmore's pride too perfectly. The slight lift of the chin, the hard glint in the eyes, the mouth that seemed always ready to command. The portrait was more than image. It was arrogance stretched across canvas. And arrogance, Dinah knew, could burn. Her chest tightened each time she thought of it, but with the tightness came a strange sense of clarity. She did not yet know how or when, but she knew this. The day would come when she would no longer bow before painted eyes. The portrait had been hung to immortalize Edward Whitmore. Instead, for Dinah, it became the seed of something else entirely, the thought that symbols could fall, and with them the men who built them. The portrait loomed in the parlor like a sentinel, Whitmore's painted eyes following Dinah through every task. The longer it hung, the harder it became for her to suppress the ember smoldering inside. Quiet submission no longer felt sufficient. She began testing the edges of her own defiance, not with bold declarations, but with small, calculated acts that seemed trivial to others, yet filled her with a dangerous sense of control. The first act came one morning when polishing silver. Dinah deliberately left a faint streak on the handle of Whitmore's goblet. When he noticed later, his brow furrowed. "Dinah," he barked, thrusting the cup toward her. "You grow careless. Polish it again." "Yes, master," she murmured, lowering her eyes. But inside, a surge of satisfaction swelled. He had seen the imperfection, but he would never know it was intentional. Another day, while arranging flowers in the dining hall, she placed them slightly off-center. Caroline noticed, her lips parting as if to correct the arrangement, yet she stopped herself. She glanced toward Dinah with a fleeting look, curious, almost questioning, but said nothing. Dinah wondered if Caroline sensed the quiet rebellion hidden in these small details. Ruth, ever watchful, noticed more quickly. "You're playing with fire," she whispered one evening in the kitchen as they kneaded bread together. "Fire warms as well as burns," Dinah replied softly, her hands steady on the dough. Ruth's eyes widened. "What if he sees through you? You know what he's capable of." Dinah met her gaze, unflinching. Better to test the walls than live forever pressed against them. Her defiance grew bolder with time. A spoon slipped from her hand, striking the floor with a clatter during a dinner. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, yet he dismissed it with a wave, too consumed with conversation to dwell on it. Another time she lingered before refilling his glass, making him wait longer than he was accustomed. His voice sharpened. "Dinah now." But she complied with deliberate calm. Each moment was a rehearsal, a test of her own courage against the boundaries of obedience. Samuel noticed the changes as well. One evening by the stables, he fixed her with a heavy stare. "I see what you're doing," he muttered, voice thick with both admiration and warning. "You think small cuts won't be seen. But enough cuts and a man bleeds." Dinah crossed her arms, her voice firm though low. "And isn't that the point?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "Rebellion without care is suicide. Every step must be weighed." He paused, then added, "You've got steel in you, girl. Just don't let that steel break before it's time." His caution did not extinguish her will. It sharpened it. Dinah knew he was right. Every act had to be chosen carefully. Yet she also felt the stirring of something she could no longer contain. To obey completely was to surrender her very self. Each small defiance was proof that her spirit was not yet crushed. There were moments of triumph hidden in these acts. When she overheard Whitmore scold another servant for a mistake that wasn't theirs but hers, she felt a flicker of power. When Caroline's eyes lingered on her with quiet recognition, Dinah wondered if even the mistress of the house understood that silence could hold its own form of resistance. But with each act came a shadow of fear. At night, lying on her cot, she replayed the day's choices. What if Whitmore suspected? What if her face betrayed her? The risks pressed heavily on her chest, but the thought of returning to absolute obedience felt heavier still. The portrait remained, silent and unmoving, yet Dinah no longer saw it only as a symbol of power. She saw it as a challenge, a face daring her to rise higher than streaked silver or misplaced flowers. And though she had not yet spoken the words aloud, she knew that her defiance was no longer about survival alone. It was about testing the strength of her chains until they cracked. Summer storms rolled across Charleston, heavy clouds darkening the harbor and sending waves crashing against the piers. Inside the Whitmore mansion, tension gathered just as thickly. The smallest mistake now seemed to ignite Edward Whitmore's temper. Dinah sensed it building, and soon the storm within the house broke. One afternoon, a young boy named Isaiah, barely 12, failed to polish the brass fixtures in the hallway, to Whitmore's satisfaction. The shine was dulled, the reflection not crisp enough. Whitmore's voice thundered, echoing down the marble floors. "Lazy! Useless!" His hand struck the boy across the face before Dinah or anyone else could move. The boy fell to the ground, his cheek red, his eyes wide with terror. Dinah froze, her heart pounding as she clutched the tray she carried. Every instinct urged her to step forward, to shield the boy, but she forced herself still. To move would be to invite the same blow, or worse. Instead, she met Isaiah's eyes as Whitmore's rage spilled over. "If you cannot do the work, you will be replaced. Do you understand?" "Yes, master," the boy stammered, voice cracking. Whitmore turned away with a dismissive snarl, as though disciplining a child were no more than swatting a fly. Caroline lingered at the stairwell, her face pale, but she said nothing. Her silence was its own kind of betrayal. That night, Dinah sat with Isaiah in the servants' quarters. She pressed a cool cloth against his cheek, the swelling rising purple. He winced, but did not cry. "I only wanted to finish faster," he whispered. Dinah's voice was steady, though her chest burned with anger. "Never give him reason, Isaiah. He waits for mistakes like a hawk circling the field." The boy nodded, eyes lowered, and Dinah swallowed the helplessness that threatened to rise in her throat. She knew this was not about brass or polish. It was about power. Whitmore needed to remind them all that fear was stronger than hope. The next days carried the weight of that lesson. Every step Dinah took felt heavier, every chore sharper with danger. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often, not only for Whitmore's gaze, but for the suspicion that even her smallest defiance might be noticed. The memory of Isaiah's trembling face haunted her, a warning carved into her thoughts. Yet fear and defiance twisted together in her heart like tangled vines. She could not shake the rage she had felt, the injustice that burned hotter than the fear. Samuel seemed to sense her turmoil when he found her at the well one evening. "You carry it heavy," he said, lowering his bucket into the water. Dinah pressed her lips tight. He struck the boy as though he were nothing. Samuel's eyes narrowed. That's how he keeps you in line. Fear makes men kings in their own eyes, but kings fall too. Dinah shook her head. Fear is heavy. It crushes before it frees. Samuel gave a low grunt, then leaned closer. Only if you let it. Fear can sharpen a blade as much as dull it. Don't let it be your chain, let it be your fire. His words lingered with her. That night she lay awake, the storm outside battering against the shutters. She thought of fear not only as a weight, but as a spark, dangerous if smothered, deadly if unleashed. She realized that every act of cruelty Whitmore inflicted carried the risk of making the very thing he feared most, resistance, grow stronger. Still, the dread clung to her. Each time she entered the parlor and felt the painted eyes of Whitmore's portrait, she thought of Isaiah's bruised cheek, of Samuel's warning, of Ruth's restless whispers. Fear pressed on her like the heavy Charleston air before lightning strikes. And though she held her head bowed, Dinah felt the ember within her pulse hotter, as though fear itself were fanning its flames. The weeks after Isaiah's punishment carried a heavy silence through the Whitmore household. Dinah moved carefully, each step measured, each gesture deliberate. Yet beneath the hush of routine, something else stirred. Threads of connection woven in secret, drawn tighter by shared suffering. She began to see that she was not alone in her quiet defiance. One evening, as the last embers in the kitchen hearth dimmed, Samuel lingered by the doorway. His weathered hands rested on the frame, his eyes searching hers. "You've been carrying too much on your own," he said. Dinah frowned, lowering her gaze. "And what choice is there? Speak too much and you vanish, act too bold and you're buried." Samuel nodded slowly. "True enough. But one voice alone is a whisper. A few voices together, well, even whispers can rattle walls." Her eyes lifted, curiosity stirring despite her caution. "And who listens to whispers in this house?" A faint smile crossed his face. "Those who know where to keep them." That night, when the mansion fell into its uneasy sleep, Samuel brought Dinah to a small shed near the stables. Inside, Ruth waited, her face lit faintly by a lantern flame. Two other figures joined them, Mary, who worked in the laundry, and Josiah, a field hand sometimes brought to the city when Whitmore needed strong arms. The air was tense, words scarce at first, but slowly the silence broke. Samuel spoke of knowledge passed quietly among the enslaved, which roots cured fever, which seeds could sicken a man, which leaves could kill if brewed too strong. His voice was low, reverent, as though speaking of sacred inheritance. "Our people carried more than chains across the ocean," he murmured. "They carried memory. The earth still listens, if we listen back." Dinah's chest tightened. She had known fragments of such things, half heard in childhood before her mother was taken. Now, hearing them spoken again, she felt a bridge stretch between past and present. Ruth leaned forward eagerly. "If we know these things, why not use them now?" Samuel's stern gaze fell on her. "Because power without patience is a blade that cuts the hand that holds it. These things are not toys, girl. They are tools, and tools must be used wisely." Josiah spoke then, his deep voice carrying the weight of long labor. "Wisdom don't change the truth. Every day we live and die at another man's word. Maybe it's time we learn to speak our own." The group fell silent, the thought heavy in the dim light. Dinah listened, her heart pounding. She had long felt the ember within her, but now she saw it mirrored in others. She was not alone. Over the following nights, the meetings continued in whispers and shadows. Mary shared stories of women who had slipped herbs into cruel masters' food, never caught. Josiah spoke of secret gatherings in the countryside where prayers doubled as plans. Ruth, restless and fiery, imagined open revolt, though Samuel tempered her words with warnings. Dinah absorbed it all. She learned which plants grew by the riverbanks, which roots hid beneath damp soil, which leaves could be gathered without drawing notice. She did not yet know what she would do with this knowledge, but each lesson filled her with strength. By day, the mansion carried on unchanged. Whitmore boasted to guests, Caroline moved gracefully through halls, and the portrait glared from its place of honor. But for Dinah, every glance exchanged with her allies was a reminder. Beneath the surface of obedience, another world existed. One evening, as she returned from the market with baskets of produce, Ruth whispered beside her, "Do you feel it too?" "That something's shifting." Dinah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, like the tide before a storm." The younger girl smiled, her eyes alight. "Then maybe we're not powerless after all." Dinah said nothing more, but the thought lingered. The ember within her no longer burned in solitude. It was joined by others, small flames hidden in shadows, waiting for the moment when darkness itself might become their ally. Autumn settled over Charleston with crisp mornings and evenings that smelled faintly of smoke from hearths across the city. The Whitmore mansion, however, pulsed with renewed energy. Edward Whitmore had announced a grand dinner, determined to remind his peers of his wealth and position. For days, the household bustled with preparation. Dinah scrubbed silver until her fingers ached, Ruth arranged linens, Mary pressed gowns, and Samuel saw to the carriages. On the afternoon of the dinner, Whitmore strode through the parlor, issuing orders like a general before battle. "The wines from France must be displayed," he barked. "The oysters fresh, the lamb tender. My guests expect nothing less." His eyes fell on Dinah as she polished a goblet. "And you, serve with grace. A master is judged by the smoothness of his table." Dinah lowered her head. "Yes, master." Inside, her thoughts coiled tighter with every word. Smoothness, grace, appearances, these were the pillars of Whitmore's world, all resting on the backs of those he refused to see. As the sun set, carriages lined Meeting Street, their lanterns glowing. Laughter spilled from the entrance hall as Charleston's elite arrived in silks and tailored coats. Dinah moved among them silently, balancing trays of wine, her face expressionless. Yet beneath her calm, her senses were sharp, her every movement deliberate. She listened to the men boast of cotton prices and trade routes, to the women compliment one another with veiled rivalry. From the head of the table, Whitmore's voice carried above all. "Gentlemen, prosperity belongs to those with discipline and strength. This city thrives because order is kept. And in my household, as in Charleston, order is absolute." His glass rose high, the portrait looming above him like an unspoken witness. Dinah's hand tightened around the wine bottle she held. She glanced up at the painted face, its smug eyes watching as if echoing Whitmore's words. Heat spread through her chest, not from the fire in the hearth, but from something deeper. Order, discipline, obedience, these were the chains he praised as though they were virtues. She poured wine into a guest's glass, her hand steady, but inside a storm gathered. Every laugh from the table felt like mockery, every toast a reminder of her own invisibility. The portrait glared down, a silent tyrant, and the ember inside her flared hotter. Later, as the courses changed and music drifted softly from the adjoining room, Dinah caught Samuel's eye from across the hall. His face was unreadable, but his nod was almost imperceptible, a reminder that she was not alone, that others carried embers too. Ruth brushed past her with a tray, whispering quickly, "They feast while we starve." "Tell me that doesn't burn in you." Dinah's voice was calm, but her words were edged. "It burns." As the night wore on, the air thickened with cigar smoke and pride. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, recounting tales of his plantation and the loyalty of those he owned. The guests applauded, raising their glasses in admiration. To them, it was entertainment. To Dinah, it was poison. She stood near the wall, watching, listening. Each boast was another stone added to the weight pressing on her chest. Yet with that weight came clarity. She realized in that moment that she could no longer endure a life where her silence fed the arrogance of men who treated humanity as property. When the final toast was raised and the laughter swelled, Dinah's gaze drifted again to the portrait above the table. The painted Whitmore stared back with cold triumph. For the first time, Dinah did not lower her eyes. She met the painted gaze with her own, steady and unflinching. And in that silent exchange, A thought crystallized, fierce and undeniable. The time was coming when she would strike, not with noise but with fire. The spark had been lit. The grand dinner left the Whitmore mansion echoing with the scent of roasted meats and spilled wine long after the guests had departed. Servants moved quietly through the halls, collecting glasses, extinguishing candles, and scrubbing away the traces of indulgence. Dinah worked among them, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The spark lit inside her during the feast had not dimmed. It burned hotter, demanding release. That night, when the house finally sank into silence, Dinah lay awake on her narrow cot. The autumn wind rattled the shutters, and the steady rhythm of Samuel's breathing nearby offered comfort. Yet her heart would not rest. She thought of the portrait in the parlor, Whitmore's painted eyes gleaming with pride, his chin lifted in defiance. That canvas was more than decoration. It was a weapon, a constant reminder that his power reached beyond flesh into legacy. The ember inside her roared. He will not outlive me in paint. Quietly she rose, her bare feet brushing against the wooden floor. Each step toward the mansion carried both terror and resolve. She knew discovery would mean death, but she also knew that silence had become unbearable. The night was thick with darkness, the air cool and damp, carrying the scent of the nearby harbor. Inside the parlor, the shadows stretched long, broken only by the faint glow of dying embers in the hearth. And there it was, the portrait, larger than life, Whitmore's gaze fixed, as though daring her. Dinah's chest tightened, her breath shallow, but she did not look away. Her hands trembled as she gathered kindling from the hearth, arranging it carefully beneath the canvas. Each movement felt louder than it was, the sound of wood against the grate echoing like thunder in her ears. She lit a sliver of cloth from the embers, the flame catching quickly, its glow illuminating her determined face. For a moment, she hesitated. Samuel's warnings whispered in her mind. Ruth's fiery impatience echoed too. Was this wisdom or recklessness? But as the flame crept along the cloth, her hesitation dissolved. She pressed it to the canvas. The fire caught slowly at first, licking the edges of the painting, then spread with greedy hunger. Colors blurred, the proud whites and dark strokes twisting into smoke. Whitmore's painted eyes melted into grotesque shapes, his grin swallowed by flame. The heat grew, the crackle rising as though the house itself protested. Dinah's breath quickened, but a fierce calm steadied her heart. She whispered, barely audible, "You will not watch me forever." The smoke thickened, filling the parlor with a sharp sting. Dinah stepped back, her pulse racing. The fire consumed faster now, curling upward, the portrait collapsing into charred fragments. For a moment she feared the blaze might spread to the curtains, but the damp night air seeping through the cracks held it back. The commotion stirred the household. Footsteps pounded the stairs, voices shouting in alarm. Dinah slipped into the corridor, moving with measured urgency. Other servants rushed past her, drawn by the smell of smoke. "The parlor!" one shouted. "Fire in the parlor!" Edward Whitmore thundered down the staircase, his robe flaring behind him. Fury etched into his face. "What is happening here?" he roared. Caroline followed, pale and trembling, clutching her shawl. They burst into the parlor to find the remains of the portrait collapsing into ashes, the once proud likeness gone. Whitmore's face twisted with disbelief, then rage. "Who did this? Who touched my painting?" His voice cracked with a mix of outrage and fear. No one answered. The servants stood frozen, eyes lowered, the smoke curling around them. Dinah kept her face calm, her hands steady at her sides. Inside, her heart hammered, but she betrayed nothing. Whitmore's fury filled the room, his shouts shaking the very walls. Yet for Dinah, standing in the shadows, a strange stillness settled within. The portrait was gone. Its power over her had burned to nothing but ash, and though danger loomed heavier than ever, she felt for the first time a taste of freedom. The ashes of the portrait lingered like a wound in the Whitmore mansion. Though servants scrubbed the parlor clean, the acrid scent of smoke refused to leave. It clung to the curtains, to the walls, to every breath of air that passed through the hall. For Edward Whitmore, the loss was unbearable. His likeness, meant to immortalize him, had been reduced to blackened fragments. He stormed through the household in a rage, interrogating each servant with sharp, cutting words. Who entered the parlor last? Who dared approach my painting? Speak! His eyes swept over them one by one, searching for the smallest tremor of guilt. Dinah kept her gaze steady, her hands folded in front of her. When Whitmore's glare fell upon her, she bowed her head with perfect composure. I was in the kitchen, master, preparing the trays, Ruth can tell you. Her voice was calm, unwavering, rehearsed in the silence of her mind. Ruth, startled by the sudden weight of being named, quickly nodded. Yes, sir. She was with me. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, suspicion lingering, but no proof surfaced. He turned away with a growl. Then one of you lies, and I will find the liar. Fear gripped the household like a vice. Every servant moved with exaggerated care, their eyes lowered more than ever, their silence heavier than usual. At night, whispers fluttered among them, questions asked in the dark. Who had done it? Who dared? Some suspected accident, others sabotage, but no one dared speak openly of fire set with intent. Dinah walked among them as if untouched, though inside her chest her heart carried both triumph and danger. Each time she passed through the parlor and saw the bare wall where the portrait had once hung, a secret satisfaction filled her veins. Yet that satisfaction was sharp-edged, for she knew discovery would mean her life. Samuel approached her quietly one evening, his face drawn with tension. You walk steady, girl, but don't fool yourself. He sees shadows everywhere now. And shadows can swallow you whole. Dinah kept her voice low. I gave him nothing to hold on to. Samuel's eyes searched hers, heavy with unspoken worry. A fire leaves traces beyond ash. Don't believe silence alone will keep you safe. The following days, Whitmore's suspicion grew like a storm cloud. He ordered the servants to gather in the yard and paced before them, his voice sharp. Someone in this household dares to defy me. Someone thinks they can spit on my name, my legacy. Hear me well, defiance will not be tolerated. If I must punish all to find the one, I will. A hush fell over the group. Dinah stood still, her face unreadable. She felt Ruth trembling beside her, and subtly pressed her hand against the girl's to steady her. No one spoke, no one confessed. Caroline stood at the edge of the gathering, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. Her lips parted once as though she might speak, but no words came. She turned away, retreating into the house, her silence as heavy as the master's threats. That night, Dinah found herself unable to sleep. The danger weighed on her like the Charleston humidity, thick and suffocating. She replayed Whitmore's words, his fury, his promise of punishment. Her body tensed with fear, yet beneath it flowed something steadier, the certainty that she could not turn back. The ashes of the portrait had marked a point of no return. Ruth whispered from the cot beside hers, voice trembling. Dinah? Do you think he knows? Dinah stared into the darkness, her voice firm despite her racing heart. He suspects everyone. But suspicion is not truth. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant call of night birds. Dinah closed her eyes, willing herself to breathe evenly, to bury her fear beneath layers of calm. The portrait was gone, but its destruction had not ended the struggle. It had only shifted it into sharper, more dangerous ground. Suspicion prowled the mansion like a restless beast, and Dinah knew she must master silence more perfectly than ever before. The destruction of the portrait had left Whitmore restless, prowling the halls as if the house itself had turned against him. He barked orders more often, demanded perfection in every chore, and punished the smallest slip with cruel words. But Dinah moved with care, every gesture precise, every answer measured. On the surface, she was the very picture of obedience. Beneath it, however, her mind turned toward darker possibilities. The whispers she had heard in the shed with Samuel and the others returned to her, seeds that sickened, roots that burned the stomach, leaves that killed when brewed too strong. She remembered Samuel's words. Our people carried more than chains across the ocean. They carried memory. That memory pulsed in her now, not as story but as path. One evening, while fetching water near the stables, she lingered until Samuel joined her. His eyes shadowed beneath the lantern glow, studied her closely. "You've been quiet, girl. Too quiet." Dinah lowered her voice. "Tell me again about the herbs, the ones that can take a man down." Samuel's brow furrowed, lines deepening across his weathered face. "That's not a game to play." "I'm not playing," she said firmly. "If chains don't break on their own, then hands must break them." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You think fire was dangerous? This is worse. Fire burns quick, poison lingers, it leaves questions, and questions point back to hands." Dinah stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Then teach me to make it so questions find no answer." For a long moment he was silent, only the crickets filling the night. At last, his voice dropped to a whisper. "There's a root grows by the riverbank, bitter when chewed, deadly in wine. You dry it, grind it fine, mix just enough to vanish in the taste. Too much, and suspicion rises. Too little, and he only falls sick. Do you understand?" Dinah nodded, her heart pounding. "I understand." "Dinah." His tone softened, almost pleading. "Once you take this step, there's no return. His wrath will fall heavy, even in death. And if you're caught, I know." Her voice cut firm, sharper than fear. "But I will not live forever beneath his painted shadow, nor his living one." Samuel's shoulders sagged, resignation in his sigh. "Then may your hands be steady." The following days blurred with purpose. Dinah carried out her duties as always, preparing meals, scrubbing floors, serving wine. But in the quiet moments she slipped to the riverbank, gathering what she needed. The root pulled easily from the damp soil, its bitter scent rising as she broke it free. She carried it hidden in her apron, her steps calm though her heart raced. At night, she dried the pieces in the warmth of the kitchen hearth, careful to keep them unnoticed. Ruth nearly caught her once, her curious eyes darting toward Dinah's hands. "What's that?" she asked. "Nothing for you," Dinah replied quickly, her tone sharp enough to silence further questions. Ruth frowned but said no more. When the root had dried, Dinah ground it between two stones, the powder fine, almost like dust. She stared at it in the dim light, the weight of it sinking into her chest. Here was power, small, fragile, but enough to topple the man who held her life. The fear never left her. Each time Whitmore barked her name, each time his gaze swept over her, she felt the hidden powder heavy in her apron. Her mind rehearsed the act over and over. Wine poured, powder slipped in, a steady hand, a calm face. One evening, Whitmore called for his drink, while boasting to a visiting merchant. Dinah carried the decanter forward, her hand brushing the pouch hidden in her apron. She hesitated, then steadied herself. Not tonight. Not yet. The time had to be chosen with care, when his pride was highest, when the fall would strike deepest. Still, as she poured the wine into his glass, her heart whispered a truth she could no longer deny. The poison was not only in her hands, it was in her will, alive, waiting. Charleston glittered under a clear night sky when Edward Whitmore prepared to host another lavish dinner. The city's elite once again filled his halls, their laughter rising above the strains of music drifting from the adjoining room. The mansion glowed with candlelight, silver gleamed on the table, and every dish spoke of excess. For Whitmore, it was another stage to flaunt his wealth. For Dinah, it was the moment she had been waiting for. She had carried the powder with her for days, hidden carefully, rehearsing every step in her mind until it felt like part of her breath. Fear accompanied her still, heavy and insistent, but alongside it pulsed a resolve stronger than trembling hands. Tonight, Whitmore would drink. Tonight, arrogance would meet silence. The dinner unfolded with familiar rhythms. Whitmore boasted loudly about his crops, his profits, his influence over Charleston's politics. His guests hung on every word, nodding in admiration. Caroline sat beside him, her hands folded neatly, her eyes betraying little, though Dinah caught the flicker of weariness there. Dinah moved through the room with steady grace, pouring wine, serving platters. Her every step felt like walking a tightrope above fire. When she approached Whitmore's chair, her hand brushed the pouch hidden beneath her apron. Her heart thundered, but her face betrayed nothing. At the signal from Whitmore, she lifted the decanter. The rich red wine flowed smoothly into his glass, the ruby liquid catching the candlelight. And in that moment, while all eyes remained on their host, Dinah let the powder slip, a fine dust dissolving without trace. Her hand trembled faintly, but she steadied it, forcing calm into her body. She set the decanter down with practiced ease, bowing slightly. Whitmore barely glanced at her. "Efficient as always," he said, already raising the glass. The sound of crystal against crystal filled the room, as the guests lifted their cups in unison. "To Charleston's prosperity," Whitmore declared. His voice rang with confidence, the portrait that once loomed over this hall now gone, yet his pride as sharp as ever. Glasses clinked. Wine touched lips. Dinah stepped back into the shadows, her breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to slow, every second stretching long as she watched Whitmore drink deeply. The wine slid down his throat, and for a heartbeat, nothing changed. Laughter resumed. Conversation flowed. Dinah's hands tightened against her apron, the weight of choice pressing harder than ever. Beside her, Ruth leaned close, whispering without moving her lips. "You did it, didn't you?" Dinah did not answer. Her eyes remained fixed on Whitmore, her silence its own reply. Minutes passed. Whitmore laughed again, gesturing broadly, recounting tales of his discipline and order. Yet a faint shift crept into his face, a slight tightening of the jaw, a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He lifted his hand to his chest briefly, then waved it off, chuckling as though brushing away a fly. None of his guests noticed. Dinah's pulse hammered. She forced her body to remain still, her expression calm, though inside every nerve strained toward the moment. Had the powder been enough? Would suspicion rise? The uncertainty gnawed, but her resolve held steady. She drifted toward the far end of the room, tray in hand, watching from the periphery. Whitmore reached again for his glass, taking another swallow. This time his smile faltered, his brow furrowed as if a shadow passed through him. He set the glass down harder than before, muttering something to Caroline. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, concern flickering across her face. Dinah's breath caught again, but she remained in the shadows, silent, steady. The hall carried on, the guests oblivious, their laughter rising. Only Dinah knew the truth, that fate had already begun its quiet work. The feast continued, yet beneath the clamor of voices and clinking glasses, something invisible had shifted. The balance of power, so long tilted toward Whitmore, now trembled, fragile as glass. The feast pressed on with the same rhythm of indulgence, but beneath its surface, something had begun to unravel. Dinah stood near the wall, her tray balanced, her eyes fixed on Edward Whitmore. At first his gestures were as grand as always, his voice booming above the chatter. But soon his movements slowed, his words caught in his throat. He shifted in his chair, pressing a hand to his chest. His smile faltered, though he tried to disguise it with another loud laugh. "Too much wine," he muttered, reaching again for his glass. Caroline leaned closer, her face pale. "Edward, are you well?" "I'm fine," he snapped, brushing her concern away. But his hand trembled slightly as he lifted the glass. Dinah saw it clearly, though the others only laughed, too absorbed in their own pride. Another swallow, another laugh, forced too loudly, and then it came, the sudden cough, sharp and jarring, echoing across the table. The guests turned their heads at last, murmurs rising. Whitmore clutched his throat, his face flushing deep red, then paling to a sickly hue. His fork clattered against his plate. Caroline's voice broke through the noise. "Edward!" She rose to her feet, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Something's wrong!" Chaos erupted. Guests leapt from their chairs, voices overlapping in panic. "Fetch a doctor!" one cried. "Water, quickly!" another shouted. Servants rushed forward, hands shaking as they obeyed. Dinah stayed in the shadows, her tray steady in her grasp, her expression calm though her pulse raced wildly. Whitmore gasped for breath, sweat glistening on his forehead. He tried to rise, but his legs faltered, sending him collapsing back into his chair. His eyes darted around the room, wild and searching. For the first time, Edward Whitmore looked small, fragile, human. Caroline knelt beside him, tears streaking her face. "Hold on, Edward, please. Help is coming." Her voice cracked, trembling between fear and disbelief. But no doctor could arrive in time. The poison worked silently, unseen. Whitmore's hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white as though clinging to the wealth and power that had defined him. His gaze flickered across the room, meeting the stares of his peers. Dinah wondered if, in that moment, he realized how fleeting his authority truly was. Samuel moved through the commotion with practiced calm, fetching water, pressing cloths to Whitmore's brow. His face betrayed nothing, though his eyes, when they briefly found Dinah's, carried the weight of knowing. Ruth, wide-eyed, stood frozen, her lips parted, but no words escaping. Whitmore's voice came in gasps, broken and uneven. This house. Mine." His words trailed into coughing, his chest heaving. Caroline clutched his hand tightly, whispering desperate prayers. Guests hovered, helpless, their earlier arrogance crumbling into fear. Dinah stepped back further into the shadows, her body hidden by the swirl of chaos. Inside her, the storm of emotions threatened to overwhelm her. Fear pressed heavy, but alongside it surged a fierce, unshakable clarity. The man who had ruled her life with commands and cruelty was falling, undone not by whip or fire, but by something so small it vanished in wine. Minutes stretched, each one longer than the last. Whitmore's strength drained visibly, his once commanding voice reduced to groans. His head slumped forward, his body sagging. The room fell into a stunned hush. Caroline's cry pierced the silence. "Edward!" She shook him, her voice breaking, but his eyes no longer focused. His chest rose once more, then slowly stilled. A chill settled over the room. The guests exchanged horrified glances, some whispering prayers, others already planning what they would tell the city come morning. Servants stood rigid, unsure whether grief or relief was expected of them. Dinah lowered her gaze, masking her face. But within, the ember that had burned for so long flared into flame. Edward Whitmore was gone. The tyrant who believed himself untouchable had collapsed before the eyes of his world. Yet even in victory, Dinah knew danger remained. Suspicion would rise, questions would linger. The fall of one man did not mean the fall of the system that had sustained him. But for tonight, one truth stood unshaken. The master who thought himself eternal had been silenced. The mansion lay under a shroud of silence after Edward Whitmore's sudden collapse. The grandeur of the evening had shattered into fragments of fear and whispers. Guests slipped away before dawn, their carriages rattling down Meeting Street, eager to distance themselves from the shadow of scandal. Servants scrubbed the dining hall with trembling hands, as if soap and water could wash away the memory of what had transpired. Caroline withdrew into her chambers, draped in black before the body was even removed. She spoke little, her voice thin and brittle when she did. "Leave me," she told the servants, eyes hollow, her hands clutched tightly around a rosary. Some pitied her, others resented her silence through years of cruelty, but none dared speak of it aloud. In the servants' quarters, the air was heavy with both dread and a strange, quiet awe. The master was gone, a man who seemed untouchable, brought low before their very eyes. Yet with awe came danger. Who would take his place, and what fury might follow? Ruth whispered fiercely as they worked. "It was him that fell, not us. Don't you feel it, Dinah? The chains ain't as heavy tonight." Dinah hushed her quickly, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Quiet, Ruth. The walls here have ears, and grief makes people cruel. Speak less, feel more." Samuel, leaning on his staff by the doorway, gave a grave nod. "The girl's right. Death don't end the system. One man's gone, but another waits to sit where he sat." His eyes met Dinah's for a fleeting moment, and she felt the weight of his unspoken question. "Was it you?" His silence protected her, but his gaze warned her to tread carefully. Days passed, and Charleston buzzed with rumor. Some claimed Whitmore had suffered a weak heart. Others swore it was an omen, punishment from God. Physicians muttered of sudden illness, while merchants whispered that perhaps someone in his own house had a hand in it. Yet no one dared speak too loudly, for suspicion was a dangerous companion. Inside the mansion, Dinah carried herself with calm precision. She poured wine, served meals, swept floors, as though nothing had changed. But inside her spirit stirred with something fierce and unyielding. Each time she walked through the parlor and saw the empty wall where the portrait once hung, she felt both fear and triumph. The man who had lorded over her life was gone, yet the silence surrounding his death reminded her that survival required caution. At night, the enslaved gathered in whispers. Mary crossed herself and shook her head. "The master's gone, but trouble ain't far behind. They'll be looking for someone to blame." Josiah's deep voice rumbled in reply. "Maybe so, but maybe it's also a sign. Men like him fall, and others will too. You can't keep people bowed forever." The room fell quiet, all eyes turning toward Dinah. She said little, only murmured, "Hope is a dangerous thing." But so is silence. Her words settled over them like the lingering smoke of a fire. Caroline's grief grew into something brittle and sharp. She summoned Dinah once, her voice low and trembling. "You were near him that night, weren't you? You poured his glass." Dinah bowed her head. "Yes, mistress, as always." Caroline's gaze lingered on her, searching for cracks, for a tremor of guilt. But Dinah's composure was flawless. At last Caroline looked away, her shoulders sagging. "Leave me." The dismissal carried no accusation, only exhaustion. Dinah returned to her duties, her breath steady, though her chest tightened with unease. Caroline's eyes had seen too much, perhaps, yet no words would pass her lips. Grief had locked her in a prison of her own. Life within the mansion stumbled forward, unsteady without Whitmore's commanding presence. Yet beneath its routines, an undercurrent of fear and possibility ran strong. For Dinah, the path ahead was uncertain, shadowed with risk. But one truth burned clear. She had struck against the unbreakable, and the world had shifted. And though suspicion lingered, whispered in corners and carried by glances, Dinah's silence held. It was her shield, her armor, her promise to the fire that still lived within her. Morning broke over Charleston with the cry of gulls and the clatter of wagons on cobblestones. The Whitmore mansion, once so loud with its master's commands, seemed quieter now, as if even its walls breathed differently. Dinah rose before dawn as always, her body still bound to routine, but her spirit carried the weight of something irrevocable. Edward Whitmore was gone, and though the world outside remained the same, her world had shifted forever. The city murmured with speculation. At the market, merchants shook their heads, debating whether Whitmore's death had been divine justice, an unlucky turn of health, or the whisper of rebellion within his own walls. Dinah heard fragments as she moved among them with her basket. "A strong man, gone so suddenly," one said. "Perhaps God tires of arrogance," muttered another. None looked at her twice. None suspected the quiet woman balancing vegetables in her arms. In the quarters, the enslaved spoke in hushed tones, weighing both relief and fear. Josiah shook his head. "One master falls, but the system stands. Don't think freedom comes easy." Ruth, still fiery, countered, "But it means they can fall, all of them." Mary crossed herself quickly. "Hush, child. Such talk brings nothing but danger." Dinah listened, her silence more powerful than words. She understood both sides. Hope was a dangerous fire, but without it, life was little more than a chain unbroken. Samuel caught her gaze across the room. He said nothing, but the faint nod of his head told her he knew, perhaps more than the others. Caroline remained a figure of mourning, her days wrapped in black. She wandered the halls as though searching for something lost, her footsteps soft, her voice quieter still. Once, she stopped Dinah in the corridor. Her eyes lingered with a strange mix of suspicion and resignation. "The house feels empty without him," she murmured. Dinah lowered her head, offering no reply. Caroline sighed, her fingers clutching the rosary she never let go. Perhaps emptiness is what he left us all. She turned and drifted away, leaving Dinah with the words echoing in her heart. Weeks passed, and life adjusted to the absence of Whitmore. The portrait's ashes had long been swept away, yet Dinah often walked through the parlor staring at the bare wall. Each time she felt the same quiet triumph. What once had loomed over her was gone, never to return. And though another man might one day hang his likeness there, Whitmore's painted gaze could never enslave her again. One dawn, Dinah stood by the harbor, the salty breeze lifting her hair. Ships swayed gently, carrying goods and passengers to distant shores. She imagined what it would mean to step aboard one, to vanish into the horizon, free of chains and shadows. For now she remained bound to Charleston, yet within her heart, freedom no longer felt like an impossible dream. It lived within her, undeniable. She thought of Isaiah, of Ruth, of all who whispered in the dark. She thought of Samuel, who had given her knowledge and warnings in equal measure. Their strength had been her strength, their silence her shield. Alone, she might have faltered, but together they had shown her that resistance was possible, even in its smallest forms. Dinah's story was not one of fairy tale freedom, nor of chains miraculously shattered. It was a story of fire and poison, of silence wielded as weapon, of courage born in shadows. It was the story of one woman who refused to let her master's power live forever, who proved that even the mightiest could fall. And though her name might never be carved into Charleston's marble or etched into its history books, it lived in the whispers of those who carried her memory. Whispers that said, "Dinah burned the master's face and made him drink his pride," whispers that refused to die. If you have followed Dinah's journey through fire, silence, and defiance, I invite you now. Subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the stories of others who stood against impossible odds. Their voices too deserve to be remembered, and if you want to keep exploring, don't stop here. Click on the video suggested on your screen and continue down the path of history's forgotten courage. Dinah's flame was only one among many, and the embers of resistance still burn, waiting to be uncovered.